5th, 2015. Okay, so we can start with homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to try an experiment in covering 2 suttas in one day. See, it's a practice of the Pali commentators when they come at the beginning of a commentary, like the commentary to the Majjhima Nikaya. They'll spend pages and pages analyzing every word, even the expression "evang me sutang," thus have I heard, gets like about 4 or 5 pages of explanation. But then when they come to the end of the commentary, they start rushing through. So I'm following their model, because we're coming now to getting close to the end of the Majjhima Nikaya. We only have 3 more classes during this semester, but early next semester, that's starting in the spring. Yeah, this week I'll try to take 143 and 147, because there's a little bit of an affinity between them. Then next week, 144 and 145, because at least one helps to illuminate the other. So that will leave just 146, 148, 49, 50, 51, 52. But what do we do when we come to Majjhima Nikaya 152? Anybody know? No. We still have to do Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 1. Oh, she had it. She was raising her finger. Wow, so she's really keeping track of what's going on. Yeah, because I left number 1 is very concise and very cryptic. So if you just, I don't know why the compilers put it at the very beginning of the Majjhima Nikaya, because if you open it and try to read it, you just can't figure it out. But after you've gone through the rest of the Majjhima Nikaya, then we could understand it, or start to understand it. Okay, so now we're taking Sutta number 143, and this is the sutta. It's called the Anāthapiṇḍikovāda Sutta, the sutta of the, here it's called advice to Anāthapiṇḍika, but Ovada is not really advice. I mean, the guy's dying. What kind of advice do you give him? But it's rather, Ovada is more like an exhortation, a kind of like an inspired discourse. Okay, so this tells us, the sutta starts when the Buddha is living at Savatthi in the Jeta's Grove, which is also called Anāthapiṇḍika's Park, because this was, according to the explanation, the commentaries, originally this kind of woods, had belonged to the prince who was the king, the son of the king of Kosala. His name was Prince Jeta. And Anāthapiṇḍika, when he was a resident of Savatthi, and when he learned about the Buddha in Rajagaha, which is quite a distance away, then he invited the Buddha to come to teach in Savatthi, and he wanted to build a monastery for the Buddha. And so he was looking around for a suitable place, and what did he find but a nice piece of land near Carmel, New York. I mean, I mean the city of Savatthi. And so he purchased that piece of land from Prince Chaita, and there he built the monastery. And this became what we call the Buddha's main seat of residence. So though the Buddha traveled around through most of the year, but during the rains retreat, it was called the Vasa, the rainy season, most or a great number of the rains retreats he spent at Anāthapiṇḍika's monastery. And so because the Buddha was living there, he forged very close relations with the citizens of Savatthi. So King Pasenadi, the king of the state of Kosala, whose capital was at Savatthi, he became a devoted supporter of the Buddha. And then the Buddha's chief male benefactor, or donor, was Anāthapiṇḍika, and also the Buddha's chief female supporter, a laywoman by the name of Visakha. She was also a resident of Savatthi. And so the Buddha had actually two residences at Savatthi. One was Anāthapiṇḍika's monastery, which I believe was probably to the west of the city. And then the lay devotee Visakha, she set up a residence for the Buddha, which was called the Eastern Park, Pubarama. And so when the Buddha, sometimes he would live in Anāthapiṇḍika's monastery, sometimes perhaps it was a little more remote, so for more better seclusion, he would go to Visakha's monastery, the Eastern Park. And so, because of the Buddha was living much of the time in Savatthi, Anāthapiṇḍika became very closely associated with the Buddha and developed great devotion to the Buddha. And in fact, under the Buddha's guidance, actually with his first encounter with the Buddha, when the Buddha gave a discourse to him, Anāthapiṇḍika became a Sotapanna, a stream enterer. I don't think there's any account in the canon of Anāthapiṇḍika going further along the path to the stage of once returner, which seems a little strange, but that's the way it is. Okay, so this sutta, one gets the impression, must be taking place pretty much towards the end of the Buddha's own lifespan, not during his very last days, but now the Buddha would be maybe his late 70s, and Anāthapiṇḍika is now an elderly man. And so now he's fallen ill. And so this sutta is going to be the discourse given to Anāthapiṇḍika on his deathbed. Okay, so the sutta tells us that on this occasion, Anāthapiṇḍika was afflicted, suffering, and gravely ill. This is a stock expression used in the suttas whenever anybody gets seriously ill. Most of the time when they are described in this way, they'll recover from their illness. But we'll see this doesn't happen with Anāthapiṇḍika. Okay, so Anāthapiṇḍika, when he's very ill, he wants some inspiration and consolation, and so he sends a message to the Buddha. So he addresses, he's a very wealthy man, Anāthapiṇḍika. He's what is called a sati. That is like a wealthy man who provides finances to the state. And so he has a servant, he sends the servant to the Buddha and says, please go to the Blessed One, pay my respects to him by bowing down at his feet, tell him that I'm very gravely ill, and then go to the venerable Sāriputta, pay respects to him, give the same message to him, and then ask Venerable Sāriputta to come to my residence out of compassion. anukampang upadaya. It's a little puzzling. Why doesn't he ask the Buddha himself to come? I don't know the explanation. One might say, oh, the Buddha would have been old, so he didn't want to impose on him. But we see in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the discourse on the Buddha's last days, the Buddha takes a long tour from Rajagaha up to Kusinara, covering several hundred miles. So if he could travel that distance in his very last months of his life, he could have taken the walk from the monastery to Anāthapiṇḍika's house. Maybe Anāthapiṇḍika wasn't aware that he was going to die, and so he didn't want to impose on the Buddha. I don't know the answer. Anyway, so he sends the message first to the Buddha, then to Sāriputta, and then Sāriputta goes to the residence of Anāthapiṇḍika, and then he asks about his health. Again, this is a standard kind of formulation. I hope you are getting well, householder. I hope you are comfortable. I hope your painful feelings are subsiding and that they are not increasing. But Anāthapiṇḍika says that this isn't the case. He says, I'm not getting well, I'm not comfortable, my pains are increasing. And then he describes his pains in very vivid terms. He says, it's just as if a strong man were splitting my head open with a sharp sword. So too, violent winds cut through my head. Just as if a man were tightening a tough leather strap around my head as a headband, so there are violent pains in my head. Just as if a skilled butcher were to carve up an ox's belly with a sharp butcher's knife, so violent winds are carving up my belly. And in the Indian physiology of this period, medical analysis, today we would call them sensations. These would be expressed as winds. Okay, just as if two strong men were to seize a weaker man by both arms and roast him over a pit of hot coals, so there is a violent burning in my body. So if you ever get ill and think you're undergoing a lot of pain, just bear this description in mind. I've done this many times. And then I think I have this chronic head pain condition, but when I read this, I think, I'm just like floating on the air compared to this description. Okay, so now we come to the heart of the sutta, where Sāriputta is giving the instructions, the actual instructions to Anāthapiṇḍika. And perhaps Sāriputta would have used his supernormal knowledge, or even maybe just empirical observation, to realize that Anāthapiṇḍika is on his way out. And so he's really going to be giving him advice now, or instructions on how to train the mind as it comes into the death process, so that one has a chance of liberation in that life itself. Okay, so Sāriputta says, you should, I'm in paragraph 5 now, then householder, you should train thus: I will not cling to the I, and my consciousness will not be dependent on the I. And in the same way, you should train regarding the ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. I will not cling to the mind, and my consciousness will not be dependent on the mind. Thus you should train. Okay, so here we have the key phrase which is going to continue through the whole rest of Sāriputta's exhortation. You don't mind if I use the Pali, because it's... Yeah, it's a very simple phrase, but it has very profound implications. So first we have na chakung upadi sami, which is what is rendered here. I will not, or I shall not. It's like making a mental determination. I shall not cling to the I. And then na me chakku nisitang vinyanang, and my consciousness will not be dependent on the I, will not be supported by the I. Okay, so what we see here is that there's actually a kind of conditional relationship here, that through clinging to, in this case, to any of the six sense bases, the consciousness comes to rely upon, to be based upon, or to be attached to these six sense bases. And it's when consciousness becomes attached, supported, dependent on any of the six sense bases, that this is what sort of supports consciousness as it makes the transition from one life to the next life. So we could say that there's this clinging, which is like holding to the six sense bases with the ideas, these are mine, this is I, this is myself. Holding to them with craving and with the view of self. So when there's that upadana, that clinging to any of these phenomena, that is providing the kind of fuel that will drive the consciousness on from this life into a new life. Because the consciousness is based upon, through clinging, it's based upon the six sense bases. And through that being based on the six sense bases in this life, through clinging, then the consciousness is going to pick up a new set of six sense bases when one passes from this life. And then that will start the process of the next life, the new life. And actually the word upadana, which is rendered clinging, it's the etymology of the word provides some insights into what is going on. Yeah, the base of the word adana, has the meaning of taking. If you know the second precept in Pali, it's adina dana veramani, that is abstaining from taking. That's adana, what is not given, adina. So this is taking, and then upa has a strengthening, a strengthening effect upon the word. So we can render it taking up. And so from upadana is taking up, we get clinging. But the idea of taking up also applies to the way a fire relates to its fuel. So the word upadana is also used to mean the fuel of a fire. And so upadana is the fuel of a fire, and clinging, upadana as clinging, is the fuel that keeps the combustion process of consciousness burning. And when consciousness is losing its fuel in this life, because the body is about to expire, it needs to arise based on some new fuel. And that new fuel will be picking up a set of 6 sense bases that begins the new life. And so through upadana, through clinging, the consciousness is settled upon, based upon, supported by, dependent on this set of 6 sense bases. And when, through the expiration of the life faculty, these 6 sense bases can no longer function as the supports for consciousness, then with upadana driving it, consciousness picks up a new set of 6 sense bases. And what happens when there is no upadana? Then what is said is that consciousness parinibhayati, which one might render, to make it decent English, it attains nibbana. But if one is going to translate very literally following the Pali, parinibhayati is a verb. So you would say consciousness becomes nibbanized, or it becomes nirvanized. Or sometimes use what's said using the simile of the fire, is that the consciousness, siti bhavati, it becomes cool, like a fire going out. Okay, so first Sāriputta gives this exhortation relating it to the 6 sense bases, but consciousness can cling to anything in the whole field of experience. So now Sāriputta is going to go through different groups of phenomena. So he says, you should train thus: I will not cling to form, sounds. These are the 6 sense objects. Form, sounds, odors, flavors, tactile objects, mind objects. Then consciousness can cling to consciousness itself. We cling to the experience of things through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. In that case, we're clinging to consciousness. So he's saying, I will not cling to the eye consciousness, and so to ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind consciousness. And then once you have the 6 sense objects, the 6 sense faculties, the 6 sense objects, the 6 kinds of consciousness, then their encounter, their coming together, which initiates any particular act of experience, that is contact. And so Sāriputta continues, I will not cling to eye contact all the ways through mind contact. And then out of contact, there arises feeling or Vedana. And Vedana, or feeling, is usually the direct object of craving. And so what we crave is generally pleasant feelings through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, or the peaceful, neutral feelings. And then when we encounter pain through any of the six senses, then we crave to escape that pain by indulging in some kind of pleasure. And so the training here given to Anāthapiṇḍika, and this is probably most directly relevant to him because he's undergoing these severe pains in his illness, is I will not cling to feeling born of eye contact, etc., born of body contact, born of mind contact. So even when one is experiencing painful feelings, of course one doesn't cling to them in the mode of desiring them, but one clings to them when one identifies with the painful feelings and thinks, oh, I have such a headache, oh, such a stomach ache, oh, why does this have to happen to me? Oh, I'm so miserable, I'm undergoing such suffering. So all of these thoughts of I and mine, thoughts of identification that arise from the feelings, these are ways of clinging to them. So he's saying, do not cling to any of these feelings through any of the senses. Okay, then he brings in some other classes of objects. And I suspect that it could be that this was not part of the original discourse, but being added by the compilers just to make the discourse more complete. Though also it could have been because Sāriputta had a very analytical mind, so it could be that he himself actually brought all of these other groups in. So we have, I will not cling to the elements. We have the 6 elements, the 4 material elements, the space element, and the consciousness element. Then we come paragraph 11, I will not cling to, here we have the 5 aggregates from material form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Then we come to, this would seem a little strange directed to Anāthapiṇḍika because from what we can see, he was not an advanced meditator, not an advanced jhanic meditator. And yet here Sāriputta is saying, I will not cling to the base of infinite space, I will not cling to the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception. These are the 4 immaterial attainments. So I say it's a bit strange because so far as I can see, I don't know of any sutta passages which speak of Anāthapiṇḍika as being an attainer of the jhanas. And to reach the formless meditations, one has to go through the 4 jhanas. And this would be an advice that like a monk would give to somebody who was, had this extraordinary ability in samadhi meditation. Because for somebody who gains these formless samadhis, it would be the subtle clinging to them would become the foundation or ground for the consciousness to become established upon them, and then to take rebirth in one of those formless realms of existence, where the lifespan is thousands of cosmic aeons, but it's not liberation. Okay, then with paragraph 13, Sāriputta broadens the scope still further, and he says, I will not cling to this world with the desire to come back to some, to some state of existence in this world. I will not cling to the world beyond, out of desire to be reborn in one of the heavens or any of the divine realms of existence. Then he takes all objects of experience comprehensively and says, I will not cling to what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, encountered, sought after, and examined by the mind, and my consciousness will not be dependent on that. Yeah, in this paragraph we actually have all of the objects of experience are grouped together into 4 sets. First we have the seen, which is identical with visible form, the heard, which is identical with sound, the sensed, which is said to comprise everything, the grosser objects of perception, that is, anything smelled, tasted, and touched. In other words, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. And then all the following words are taken to represent objects of a purely mental consciousness. That is, the main word here is cognized, viññātaṃ, and then the other terms, encountered, sought after, examined by the mind, are just elaborations on cognized. And then my consciousness will not be dependent on that. Thus you should train. So that is Sāriputta's Vāda, his exhortation, his instruction to Anāthapiṇḍika. So he's, the purport is that he's advising Anāthapiṇḍika not to be attached to anything within the subjective and objective domains of experience. And when there is not that attachment, not that clinging, consciousness will not be dependent upon it. When consciousness is not dependent upon it, then with your passing, your consciousness will parinibhāyisati. It will be nirvanized. It will attain nirvana, go into nibbana, so to speak. Okay, so when Sāriputta finishes his exhortation, then Anāthapiṇḍika starts weeping and he sheds tears. And now Ananda has gone along with Sāriputta as his companion. And so when Anāthapiṇḍika starts weeping, then Venerable Ananda, he thinks, Anāthapiṇḍika must be feeling miserable, and he must be really frightened and agitated that he's going to be dying and that he's going to be leaving behind all of his loved ones and his possessions. And so he says to Anāthapiṇḍika, are you foundering householder, excuse me, are you foundering householder, are you sinking? Okay, then Anāthapiṇḍika says something that seems a bit surprising and also a little bit puzzling, even to me. He says, I'm not foundering, Bhante Ananda, I'm not sinking, but though I have long waited upon the teacher, the Buddha, and the venerable bhikkhus, never before have I heard such a talk on the Dhamma. Okay, then Ananda says to Anāthapiṇḍika. He says, such a talk on the Dhamma, such Dhammakata, is not given to lay people clothed in white. Such talk on the Dhamma is given to those who have gone forth. In other words, to monastics. Okay, this needs a little unpacking or drawing out. And I say it's a little puzzling because, okay, it's said in the commentaries that when the Buddha is giving many of these like profound discourses in the Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, though he says, "Oh bhikkhus," like he's addressing monks, but the commentaries say that actually the fourfold assembly is present, so that there will be bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, upasakas, male lay devotees, male lay followers, and upasika, women lay followers. So we'd see, from this we could see that lay people will also be listening to these discourses. But what I could see is that when Anāthapiṇḍika comes to the Buddha for a personal discourse, the Buddha always speaks to him about, from the standpoint of the Dhamma, about how to conduct one's affairs as a householder. Like, what is the proper use of wealth? How is a lay person happy in the household life? How does one take care of one's wife and children? Occasionally he'll speak about how a householder should go off in seclusion and reflect on the virtues of the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, on the virtues that reflect on his own practice of morality, generosity. But I'm not aware of discourses and where the Buddha is speaking one-on-one, so to speak, to Anāthapiṇḍika, where he says, don't be attached to anything seen, heard, sensed, cognized. And the reason, perhaps, is that Anāthapiṇḍika was generally a very wealthy householder, a large household with a lot of affairs to take care of. He is reputed to have been, as I said earlier, what's called in India a sati or shreshti, one with a lot of wealth, almost like the treasurer, the state, but not the actual treasurer, but like a banker, okay, a banker, one with a lot of wealth who provides sponsorship to the king so that the king can conduct the affairs of state. The unholy alliance of the politicians and financial institutions. But Anāthapiṇḍika, of course, was a man of upright conduct. And so, for this reason, I think when the Buddha or the venerable monks are speaking to Anāthapiṇḍika, they don't speak to him, they don't give him these high, profound discourses. And there were some householders, though, who had very, very deep and very astute knowledge of the Dhamma, and apparently high attainments in meditation. Especially the one who's mentioned as outstanding in that respect is one called Citta, the householder, who has a whole chapter to himself in the Samyutta Nikaya. I think it's chapter 41. And Citta would sometimes invite the monks to come for an alms offering, and then he would give them, coming, like playing the role of a simple householder, and he would give them a question. Bhante, what is the meaning of this? How do you explain that? And sometimes the monks would all be stumped by his question. And then since Citta has to take on a humble role, according to the monks, he would say, well, the way I understand it, it's this way. And actually, he's actually referring in his explanation back to a discourse by the Buddha, And then the monks would say, "Sadhu, sadhu, householder, you have such a clear and deep understanding of the Dhamma." So I don't think this should be taken as a generalization, though Anāthapiṇḍika is probably just explaining on the basis of his own experience. But Ananda's answer still has to be taken in the sense, again, it needs a little interpretation, that probably what he means is that on an individual basis, this type of discourse is not given to householders in white, because they are concerned with all of the travails, the day-to-day difficulties of managing their household life. But if they come, if they come in the evening to hear the evening discourse that the Buddha is giving to the monks, then they will get to listen, to hear such discourses. Okay, but then Anāthapiṇḍika makes this great plea to Sāriputta. He says, "Please, Bhante Sāriputta, let such Dhamma talks be given to lay people clothed in white." And clothed in white, I should mention, because in the Asian countries, in India during the Buddha's time, in Sri Lanka today, when lay people, devout lay people, go to the monastery, they wear white. I think maybe because of the commercially produced clothing, that tradition is sort of fading out. But in the earlier times, they would always wear white, particularly when they are undertaking the special precepts. Then they wear the white clothing. Okay, so Anāthapiṇḍika continues, "Please let such talks be given to the lay people clothed in white. There are clansmen, I should say clans people, let's just say people, there are people with little dust in their eyes who are wasting away, who are, fading away through not hearing such talk on the Dhamma. There will be those who will understand the Dhamma." And what's interesting is, has anybody encountered those exact words before in a different context? Exactly. If you remember, you go back to Sutta number 26, don't look at it now, I'm just referring to it. If you look at Sutta number 26 in the Majjhima Nikaya, when after the Buddha's enlightenment, when he's sitting on the seat near the Bodhi tree, and then he's pondering, should I teach the Dhamma to the world or not? And then it said he looks out at the world and he sees people are just so wrapped up in greed, hatred, and delusion. If I were to teach the Dhamma, nobody would be interested. They're all, looking at their little phones, all glued to their iPhones or iPads, and what do they call them, tablets. And here, abandon greed, hatred, and delusion. Wait a moment, Bhante, there's some interesting movie on. Or in this country, addicted to their guns. And so, the Buddha thinks if I try to teach the Dhamma, they're not going to be interested. It's just going to be trouble for me, and it's not going to do any good for the others. Okay, so when the Buddha has this thought, then a Brahma, a high divinity named Sahampati, he sort of vanishes from the celestial realm. He comes and appears in front of the Buddha, and he says, "Please, Bhante, don't think in that way. Look out at the world. There are some with little dust in their eyes who are fading away through not hearing the Dhamma, they will be able to understand. And then the Buddha, when he hears that request, then he looks out again with his super Buddha vision upon the world, and then he sees that there are indeed people who can understand, and then he decides to teach. Okay, so that is Anāthapiṇḍika's great request, or maybe his last words, to Sāriputta. Okay, then after this discussion, Sāriputta and Ananda leave Anāthapiṇḍika's house. They go back to the monastery, and soon afterwards, Anāthapiṇḍika passes away. Even though he might have been trying to meditate according to Sāriputta's instructions, he didn't reach the goal. So his consciousness was not yet parinibhayati, was not yet nirvanized. And so he passed away, and he was reborn in the Tusita heaven. The Tusita heaven is 1, 2, 3, the fourth level of the 6 sense-sphere heavenly realms. And that is said to be the abode where the Bodhisattva Maitreya is now dwelling. And from there, when Gautama Buddha's teaching disappears, then at some time in the future, Maitreya Bodhisattva will descend from the Tusita heaven and come into the human realm and then become a Buddha. Okay, so Anāthapiṇḍika is reborn in the Tusita heaven, and then it's said that in the commentary it said that after he was reborn there, and he sees his heavenly good fortune, and he ponders, how did I get to arise here? How did I achieve such good fortune? And when he ponders on that question, then he sees that, this all happened because of the merits that I accumulated as a supporter, a benefactor of the Buddha and the Sangha. And so then he thinks, let me come down and pay them a visit to express my appreciation. And so, of course, he doesn't come down like a human being, or he doesn't come in the middle of the day, but it's the practice. The devas come to the Buddha usually in the dead of the night when everybody else is sleeping and everything is quieted down. I think this would have happened much more often back in ancient times when the world was very quiet and relatively, I don't think the world was ever peaceful. I mean, there were wars going on all the time. But we didn't have all of this electronic gadgetry, which I think creates, my opinion, this is not from a Pali commentary, creates a kind of a vibrational field which is repulsive to the deities. And maybe it interferes with their own vibrational frequencies. And so they don't come down here to visit so often. But I would think in ancient times, when we didn't have all of this, these kinds of powerful forms of energy, like electricity, and all of these communications, lines of communication, electronic communication, and these, polluting the world with all of these substances that we're burning, creating so much dirt and pollution, then the deities want to keep away, keep a distance. But in earlier times, there would have been much easier communication between the divine realms and the human realm. So that's why we have scriptures from the great religious traditions which speak about encounters, frequent encounters between the human and the divine. Okay, so here Anāthapiṇḍika comes to the Buddha in the middle of the night, and he recites some verses expressing his appreciation of the Jeta's grove, which he himself had donated to the Buddha, and then giving some instruction on how to live the wholesome life, and then praising Sāriputta. So he says, "Oh, blessed is this Jeta's grove, dwelt in by the sagely Sangha, wherein resides the king of the Dhammaraja, the Buddha, the fount of all my happiness." So that's praise of the grove, the Sangha, and the Buddha. Then he speaks like words of advice to the world. By action, knowledge, and Dhamma, by virtue and a noble way of life, by these are mortals purified, not by lineage or wealth. Therefore, a wise person who sees what truly leads to his own good should investigate the Dhamma. Maybe that's significant coming from Anāthapiṇḍika, who is not known to be an investigator of the Dhamma, and purify himself with it. And then he praises Sāriputta. Sāriputta has reached the peak in virtue, peace, and the ways of wisdom. Any monk who has gone beyond, at best, can only equal him. Okay, so Anāthapiṇḍika recites these verses. The teacher, probably by silence, approves of them, or maybe he actually spoke approving them. And then Anāthapiṇḍika vanished. Okay, then the next day, the Buddha addresses the monks and he tells them that he's sort of testing them, and he says, in the middle of the night, a young god of beautiful appearance came to me, illuminating this whole Jeta's grove. And after saluting me, then he recited these verses. Then he repeats the verses. And then he vanished. Okay, when he says this, then the venerable Ananda says to the Buddha, he says, "Surely, Bhante, that young deity must have been Anāthapiṇḍika, for the householder Anāthapiṇḍika had perfect or full confidence in the venerable Sāriputta." Okay, then what the Buddha says, it's interesting. He says, first he applauds Ananda. He says, good, Ananda. Then he says, the Pali goes, "Yava takkang takkaya pattabang anupatang tang taya," which means, very literally, as far as it might be reached by thinking, that by you has been reached. So that is a very literal rendering. Or that by you have arrived at that. So that's what's translated here. As far as reasoning goes, you have drawn the right conclusion. Because, and then the Buddha says, that young god indeed was Anāthapiṇḍika, no one else. Okay, the reason why the Buddha says this to Ananda is that Ananda is going by inference. He's drawing from the fact, probably first, that the deity praised Jeta's grove, and then he praised Sāriputta. And so he thought that since Anāthapiṇḍika has just died and our deity has appeared and praised the grove and the Sāriputta, that must be Anāthapiṇḍika. But the Buddha doesn't have to yava takkang takkaya pattang. He doesn't have to go by thought, by reasoning. The Buddha himself knows directly that was Anāthapiṇḍika. Okay, and that is the discourse